I'm sure Paul said already that I'll be covering an overview of Job, one part this week and then one part in 2 weeks. My schedule doesn't allow that we do it at the beginning. That would make more sense, but we're not doing it that way. The scripture says, if anyone among you is suffering, let him pray. And we just prayed for a lot of suffering people. There's a lot of people on that prayer list. But suffering it's a taboo word in our society. It's not something we like to talk about a lot in our culture. It's something that's pushed off into the hospitals, pushed off into the nursing homes, something that's medicated, something that's surgically fixed. And it's certainly not something that many people in our culture meditate upon or think about or consider noble. But those are the things that we're going to be trying to do when we study Job. And it's also the reason that Job is so important to the church. The church here in the West is tempted to go along with that culture. Most blatantly in the prosperity gospel that says if we serve God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we'll get everything that we want, and we'll be the happiest people alive. But more subtly in doctrines like Christian hedonism, which says that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. But I don't think that's right either. You think about Jesus when he was in Gethsemane mourning the cross. He was not happy as a lark. He was sweating drops of blood. He was learning obedience as a son through the things that he suffered. And so suffering is part of what it is to be a Christian. Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me." That's the beginning and end of our religion. It is the basis of our faith. It reminds me of what was written in Hebrews chapter 11. Talking about people who have the same faith as we do. Starting in the middle of verse 35, some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and in mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. This is our faith. It is a faith that is deeply intertwined with suffering. And so I suppose we should start with Job. The book of Job begins with saying that Job lived in the land of Uz. And the land of Uz is different than the land of Oz. It's not a fictional place. There's not a yellow brick road leading up to it. Ezekiel and Lamentations place Job somewhere near Edom in ancient times, which is near modern-day Jordan. And if you recall, I think you guys made it to chapter 3, so you would have covered that it was the Sabeans and the Chaldeans that came and robbed Job, and those are also historical peoples. We have a lot of history and archaeology associated with these people. So the book of Job is history. There are a lot of people who say that the book of Job is not history and only a story. And we might be tempted to swing in the other side of the pendulum and say the book of Job is history and not a story. But the book of Job is also a story. It begins as many stories do. In a land far away, there once was a man named Job. He was the greatest in all of the East, healthy, wealthy, and wise. And it ends as many stories do. He lived happily ever after. So the book of Job is history, and the book of Job is a story. But how is that possible? We often think of history and story as opposite things. It's possible because God is providential. And what we mean by that is that God is the author of history. He's in control. He calls all the shots. And he's not a bad author. He's not like one of those horrible history teachers you had, just rattling off dates and names and places, expecting you to absorb it and then regurgitate it for the test. He's writing history in a way that absorbs our attention, and he holds our attention in order to offer us salvation. And more than that, the God who wrote Job's history is the same God that's writing our history. Job does not have a different God than we do. And Job is not a different kind of servant than we are. And so we can trust God to write our story just as he wrote Job's. One with a happy ending, even if it is through suffering. And we will suffer, as I mentioned before. If you're a Christian, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Many of you have lived longer than I have, and I'm sure you've suffered more than I have. Take up your cross and follow me. That's what it's all about. Or in the words of James 5, as an example, brothers and sisters of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. We count those blessed who endured. For you've heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. So when we suffer, what does James say that we ought to do? We ought to endure patiently. And why do we endure patiently? It is because we trust God to bless us just as he blessed Job. So as we read Job, one of the important things to do is to remember that this is our history too. It's our story too. This is our God. So the suspense begins in chapter 1, verse 6. And I know you've covered this already. I'm going to just blow by this as fast as I can. There's suspense here because we get to see what Job can't. It's God's throne room. So Satan approaches Job, or God. God says, Job is blameless. Satan says he's only that way because he's wealthy. If you take away his wealth, he'll stop serving you. God says you can take away his wealth, but you can't take away his health. And that's what we see. But what Job sees is dead livestock, dead servants, and dead children. And even though he doesn't see what we see, he maintains his blamelessness. Then Satan approaches God again. Job is still blameless. That's what God says. Satan says it's only because he's healthy. If you take away his health, he won't serve you. But God says you can take away his health, but you can't take away his life. That's what we see. But Job sees nothing but sores from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, and he's scraping himself with pottery. And even though he doesn't see what we see, he maintains that blamelessness. And then what happens next is unexpected. There is silence. There's silence in heaven, and there's silence on earth. So first there's silence in heaven. Classic example of this, it's breaking a couple of storytelling rules. The first storytelling rule is something you see in Goldilocks. The Papa Bear sat on the bed and it was too hard. The Mama Bear sat on the bed and it was too soft. And then the baby bear found the bed and it was just right. But we're not seeing that third throne room scene. Breaks another rule, a rule of amplification. Have you ever read those books, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie? If you give a mouse a cookie, I think it goes, he's going to ask for a glass of milk, and if you give him a glass of milk, he's going to ask for a straw to go with it. We might expect that this is the way that Job's story goes. What might we expect the third throne room scene to look like? I think we ought to expect it goes something like this. Satan comes to God and says, he's only serving you because he has his life. Remember, the first time he says it's because he has his wealth. The second time he says it's because he has his health, but you can't take his life. We'd expect Satan to ask for his life as well. But we don't see that throne room scene. There is silence in heaven. Why do you think that is? I think the reason that is the case is because there is only one suffering servant whose life God granted Satan to take. We'll talk about that more next week. But God will not give Satan Job's life. He's preserving Job's life. And that's what makes the story of Job continue the way it does. And then there's silence on earth. Job's friends arrive, and they don't say a word for a whole week. And it's not because they don't have anything to say. They speak for about 30-something chapters, and Paul's going to be talking about that for a couple of months. There is a kind of suffering that is so intense, there's nothing to say. You know, if somebody slices their thumb, gets a paper cut, right away you can say, I hate when that happens. Dad called me a week ago and said that he smashed his thumb and broke it. And, you know, there's that I couldn't respond to right away. He says, I'm sorry to hear that. How did it happen? But when Job's friends arrive, it requires a week of silence. And I work in the hospital, and I've seen it a couple of times where there's a suffering so intense there's nothing to say. And we're replacing the function of people's kidneys, we're replacing the function of their lungs, we're replacing the function of their heart. They're on all of the drips in the world. And you can't help but thinking, I'm just going to have to wait on God for the outcome of this. And I think that's what's happening when Job's friends arrive too. There's nothing that human intervention can do for this situation. This is something that God is going to have to work out, and we're going to have to wait for him. But for a whole week, God does not answer. And only after being left in limbo do Job's friends begin giving their answers. We're not meant to be too distant or analytical about this. We're meant to sit in silence with Job and meditate on his suffering. Watch him scrape his sores. Watch him sob with grief over his lost family. Watch him sit with ashes on his head and tear his shirt. And I think we also have this issue sometimes when we think about Christ on the cross. We have a tendency to think, what exactly happened on the cross? Was it penal substitutionary atonement, or was it Christus Victor atonement, or something else? Sometimes the way to respond to the cross is to despise it as other people did. It was a horrible execution and death. We have to meditate on Christ's sufferings in a guttural way. And this doesn't come naturally to us. As I mentioned again, in our culture, we don't think about suffering the way that Job's audience thought about suffering. It was a common part of life, something that modern medicine couldn't achieve, or couldn't fix. And we see this even in our worship service sometimes. We sing blue skies and rainbows and sunbeams from heaven, and he walks with me in the garden, and he knows that I'm his own. But when I was preparing the Psalms to sing in church, one of the reasons that I didn't continue singing them as much as I would like to is it's very difficult to pick Psalms that I think everybody would like to sing. A lot of the Psalms, David says, my head, shoulders, knees, and toes hurt, and I can't drink anything but my tears, and I'm so hungry I could eat a cactus. And it's hard to think that we would be able to worship in those ways, but David did, because suffering is an intrinsic part of what it means to have faith in God, and it's an intrinsic part of the human experience. Now that I think of it, maybe we should sing those psalms. But we're meant to sit with Job. This is meant to make us begin thinking about the questions that Job and his friends are trying to answer. Why is Job suffering? Why is he not dying? Or why isn't he living with all the wealth and health he had before? And where is God in all of this? These are the questions that we're supposed to answer, and we're supposed to feel them with Job as well. Now that's the intro. Now it's time to go to the very end and have a little spoiler alert. Job and his friends are about to give all of their answers for 30-something chapters. And without an answer from heaven, without an answer from God, having silence up there, all of these earthly answers are going to sound more and more plausible as we go along. And it's going to be easy to lose the story and all the back and forth. So the plan is we're going to use the end of the book as a compass to keep us on track all the way through. Who are we going to trust? We're going to look to the end of the book to see this. If you'd like to read with me, I'm starting in chapter 42, verse 7. It came about, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, therefore, take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job will pray for you. For I will accept him, so that I may not do with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord told them, and the Lord accepted Job. So we will not be trusting Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They did not speak rightly about God. And that's a weird feeling, because that constitutes about 15, 20 chapters in the book of Job that's actually, God says, wasn't true. And then God also says that Job spoke rightly about him. If you've read the book of Job, though, I'm sure all of you have more than once, you'll know that Job spoke things about God that were as wrong can be. And that's not just my impression. That is Job's confession in the same chapter, starting in verse 2. He says, "I know you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, 'Who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge?' Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know." So God said Job spoke right, but Job says, "I spoke wrong." Now what do we do? What does that mean? It means that we have to be careful and even trusting Job. When can we trust Job? We can trust him when he defends his blamelessness. And we know from the beginning that he is blameless. That's what God said to Satan in the throne room. But when Job starts accusing God for his suffering, that's when our trust should fall apart. After all, that's when his trust in God is beginning to fall apart. So, God says Job spoke rightly, that he was not punishing him for evil. But Job says, "I spoke wrongly, that you were making a mistake." So in the end, who we should really trust in the book of Job, as always, is God. Always trust God. God tells Job in the end what we've known all along since that first courtroom scene, that he is sovereign, he's in charge, he calls the shots, he writes the history, he tells Satan here and no farther. This is the line. He has Satan on a leash like his pet dog. Sometimes we don't see the whole picture. We might see what's happening on earth, but we don't always see what's happening in heaven. And so when we see a suffering servant, or we are a suffering servant, it's time to trust God. And we know that Job's trust is God's purpose in all of this, because once he confesses that his trust is restored, Job's health and wealth is restored along with it. So that was a very big spoiler alert, and I almost want to apologize to Paul because he has to teach all that all over again. But it's really going to help us through the next 30-something chapters of gobbledygook. First, let's summarize Job's friend's argument. So we're going to do this 30 chapters of arguing between Job and his friends now. Let's summarize Job's friend's argument best I can. If God is perfectly righteous, and if God is perfectly powerful, then he does good to those who are good, and he does bad to those who are bad. In essence, it's karma. It is the basis of all the world's religions. It is what the atheists claim is wrong. It is the reason that God doesn't exist. They say, if God is all-powerful and all-righteous, then why is there suffering at all? That's the same argument that Job's friends are using. So they're claiming that since Job is suffering, he must have done something to deserve it from God. Here's a couple of examples for you, just from the vending machine. We're not going to eat a whole meal off of God's word right now, but chapter 3, starting in 7 to 8, excuse me. Chapter 3, starting in verse 7 to 8. Remember now whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it. The next one's chapter 22, verses 4 to 7. Is it because of your reverence that he reproves you, that he enters into judgment against you? Is not your wickedness great, and your iniquities without end? For you have taken pledges of your brothers without cause, and stripped men naked. To the weary you have given no water to drink, and from the hungry you have withheld bread. That is what Job's friends are claiming he has done. It sounds like the book of Proverbs in some places. The book of Proverbs says that God helps the people who do good, but the people who do bad fall into death and disorder. But Job's rebuttal is more like the book of Ecclesiastes. He's saying, my life is meaningless. I've done good, but I'm getting a bad result anyway. And remember that last part is true. He is good. He's blameless. That's what God said. And so we can trust him when he says so. Here's a couple examples of that. Chapter 6, verses 28 to 30. 6:28 to 30. But now be so kind as to look at me. Would I lie to your face? Relent, do not be unjust. Reconsider, for my integrity is at stake. Is there any wickedness on my lips? And can my mouth not discern malice? Another example is in chapter 28, verses 5 and 6. Excuse me, I'm messing up my numbers tonight. 27, verses 5 and 6. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. But then Job's argument continues. And then he claims that God is not to be trusted, that he is the cause of Job's suffering. And that's where he goes wrong. Chapter 6, verse 4 is an example of this. Job says, the arrows of the Almighty are within me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God line up against me. Chapter 9, verses 17 and 18. He bruises me with a storm and multiplies my wounds without cause. He will not allow me to get my breath. but he saturates me with bitterness. Chapter 9, verses 22 to 24 says, he destroys the guiltless and the wicked. If the whip kills suddenly, he mocks the despair of the innocent. The earth is handed over to the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. If it's not him, who is it? And lastly, chapter 12, verse 6. Two more. 12, verse 6. The tents of the destroyers prosper, and those who provoke God are secure, whom God brings into their power. Then finally, chapter 19, verses 6 and 7. Know then that God has wronged me, and has surrounded me with his net. I cry violence, but I get no answer. I shout for help, but there is no justice. So this is Job's argument in a nutshell. I'm righteous and I'm suffering, and that's not fair. Plenty of unrighteous people don't suffer, and that's not fair either. So this is Job's conclusion. If God is letting all of this happen, he's unjust, unrighteous, and untrustworthy. But next, not to worry, Job has a plan. He says multiple times that he wants to file a lawsuit against God, against the judge, jury, and executioner of the universe. And this isn't just a cutesy way of me outlining my class material. He blatantly says multiple times he wants to take God to court. This should go really well. But at least Job admits his problem in chapter 9, verses 2 to 4. How can a person be in the right with God? If one wished to dispute with him, he could not answer him once in 1,000 times. Wise in heart and mighty in strength, who has defied him without harm? And again in verses 19 and 20 of the same chapter, if it's a matter of power, behold, he is the strong one. And if it's a matter of justice, who can summon him? Though I am righteous, my mouth would condemn me. And though I'm guiltless, he would declare me guilty. What would you do if you were in Job's situation? I know what I'd do. 1-800-CALL-SAM. And actually, after Job realizes the absurdity of what he's asking, it's exactly what he does. He begins to ask God to provide him with a prosecuting attorney, a really good one. Chapter 9, verses 32 to 35 says this: For he is not a man as I am, that I might answer him, that we might go to court together. There is no arbitrator, no lawyer between us, who can place his hand upon us both. Let him remove his rod from me, and let not the dread of him terrify me. Then I would speak and not fear him, but I am not like that in myself. Now, most of you have all read Job before, and you'll remember that God will take Job to court just like he asked, in the whirlwind, in the tornado. That's his judgment seat. But do you remember if God ever provides a mediator like Job asked for? We're going to be looking for Job's lawyer in 2 weeks. We're going to sing some songs. That's all I got for now. Do you have any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Just one, the 3 men that came to see Job. That problem went on all the way to Christ, because when Christ was there, he was healing the blind man, and they said, what did this man do, or what did his family do? What sin did they commit that caused him to be blind? And he said, well, he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. It was just through the word of God. That's kind of what this is.
Right. And to show God's glory through suffering, that's always been God's plan through it all.